Okay, let's unpack this. Cranberries. You see them at Thanksgiving, you find them year-round lining the juice aisle, and for generations, they've been attached to one incredibly resilient health claim: bladder health. But in a world just full of supposed superfoods, what does the latest, high-certainty science actually say about this humble, tart red berry? Is this a foundational preventative health tool, or are we mostly just falling for a highly sweetened marketing campaign?
It's one of the most interesting areas in nutritional science right now, I think, because the evidence on cranberries is remarkably specific and, in some ways, really technical. It's not a general panacea. It's a very targeted solution. If you know how to use it, and more importantly, how much to use, the benefit is, well, it's undeniable for certain populations.
And that's the core of our deep dive today, isn't it? We have compiled some extensive systematic reviews, meta-analyses, including the very latest updates from high-authority bodies like Cochrane. We want to give you the definitive, evidence-based breakdown of cranberry effects and really move beyond that common knowledge, giving you the critical dosing thresholds, the safety rules you absolutely need to know, and separating the genuine, proven benefit from the intriguing but unproven hype.
And what makes our source material so trustworthy today is that a lot of it has been evaluated using the GRADE framework. That's the grading of recommendations assessment, development, and evaluation.
The gold standard.
It is the gold standard for clinical evidence, and it tells us exactly how strong the data is. We can clearly distinguish between those high-certainty benefits, the things you can absolutely rely on for prevention, and the areas where the findings are, preliminary or low certainty. It lets us focus precisely on the most trustworthy science.
Exactly. Our mission is to transform you from someone who vaguely buys cranberry juice to someone who understands the molecular mechanism, the critical milligram threshold required for efficacy. So let's just stop wasting time on the vague claims and start where the evidence is clearest and strongest. So this is where it gets really interesting, because the folk remedy narrative we've had about cranberries for decades, it's actually confirmed by modern science, but with some really crucial clinical and biological nuance. We're talking about high-quality evidence supporting cranberry products for the prevention of symptomatic, culture-verified urinary tract infections, especially the recurrent ones.
Yes, and we are now in the territory of moderate to high certainty. That's according to those major systematic reviews updated as recently as 2023.
So this is fresh data.
Very fresh, and that's a key point to emphasize. The Cochrane Review, which again represents the highest level of clinical evidence synthesis, it pooled data from 50 randomized controlled trials. 50, involving almost 9,000 participants across all sorts of different groups. And the overall conclusion is consistent. Taking cranberry products significantly reduces the risk of UTIs. The relative risk reduction found in these pooled studies was consistently around 30%.
30%. That is a clear, measurable clinical effect that can genuinely impact a person's quality of life.
It's huge impact.
But you mentioned nuance. So a 30% reduction is significant, but the benefit isn't a blanket statement for everyone, is it? The science shows it is highly targeted. Can you break down the specific populations that saw the most dramatic and robust benefit? Because this is vital for you to understand if you fall into that high benefit group.
Absolutely. And the researchers doing these meta-analyses were rigorous in drilling down into the specific subgroups. This is where the picture becomes crystal clear. The primary and most validated target population is women with recurrent UTIs.
Okay, and define recurrent for us. What's the clinical threshold?
We're talking about individuals who suffer from 2 or more infections in 6 months or 3 or more in a single year. For this specific susceptible group, pooled randomized controlled trials found the risk reduction range from 26% to a really robust 35% compared to placebo.
That is a huge difference. I mean, for anyone who has experienced the pain, the disruption, the repeated courses of antibiotics that come with recurrent UTIs, that reduction is life-changing. But what does the 30% reduction translate to in, practical terms? We hear numbers like that all the time. How do we know this is clinically meaningful and not just statistically interesting?
That's where we use this critical clinical metric. It's known as the number needed to treat, or NNT.
Right, the NNT.
The NNT tells you how many people you need to treat with an intervention cranberries, in this case for just one person to benefit. So for one person to avoid one UTI over the study period, which is typically 6 months.
Let's talk about that NNT. What is it here?
In this specific group of women with recurrent UTIs, the NNT is low. It's around 7.
7. Wow.
Think about what that means. For every 7 women who consistently incorporate standardized cranberry products into their daily regimen, one person avoids a week or more of painful symptoms. One person avoids a trip to the doctor and avoids a full course of antibiotics, which we know have their own downstream consequences on the microbiome. An NNT of 7 in preventative medicine, especially with a safe, natural product, is considered an excellent return on investment.
That really brings the data to life. It's not just a statistic anymore. So if you are prone to recurrent UTIs, the evidence is strongly in your favor to try this as a preventative measure. But what about other high-risk groups? You mentioned the sources showed the benefit can actually be more pronounced elsewhere.
Yes, surprisingly so. The effects were even stronger in other susceptible groups, which, it raises some interesting questions about underlying metabolism and bacterial burden. For instance, children who experience recurrent UTIs showed an exceptional risk reduction in some analyses. We're talking up to 45% to 54%.
Wait, a natural product showed an even stronger effect in kids than in adults? Why would that be?
It's an excellent question, and the exact reason is still being investigated, but it could be due to a few things. Children tend to have different underlying microbiota compositions, which, as we'll discuss later, are crucial for processing the active ingredients. It could also relate to differences in bladder physiology or urinary flow dynamics, but clinically, the difference is clear. In that pediatric population, the NNT drops to just 4.
4. That's astounding.
It means only 4 children need to take cranberries for one to avoid an infection over 6 months. That is an incredibly powerful prophylactic signal.
It's hard to ignore that data.
Yeah.
What about the other major high-risk groups? People whose susceptibility comes from, say, a medical intervention or a specific medical state.
The evidence here is also very strong and highly specific. The sources showed substantial risk reductions, up to 51% in people made susceptible by medical interventions. This includes groups like those post-surgery or individuals with indwelling catheters. These patients face really high infection rates, and the effect size of cranberries in these specific high-risk contexts is so large and the studies so consistent that some analyses even rate the evidence as high certainty.
Because the mechanism is just so direct.
The mechanism, which we'll get to, works consistently to prevent that initial step of colonization. It doesn't matter what your underlying health status is, it's very effective there.
So we have these very clear winners in the evidence. Women with recurrent UTIs, children with recurrent UTIs, and patients with specific medical susceptibility. But the systematic reviews also included a necessary cautionary note, right? They specified populations where the benefit was either weak or non-significant. Who falls into those groups?
This is a critical distinction, so people don't waste time or rely on a treatment that won't work for them. The evidence was found to be weak, non-significant, or just insufficient for preventing UTIs in pregnant women, elderly institutionalized residents, and individuals with neuromuscular bladder dysfunction.
Okay. So for those groups, the data just isn't there.
Exactly. For those populations, the data was either too inconsistent or the measured effect was too close to the null effect. So it's important for these groups not to rely on cranberries as a proven prevention method, even if they're been generally safe to consume.
And before we move on, let's be absolutely definitive on this point. Cranberry is a preventative measure. It's a prophylactic tool designed to stop the infection before it starts. It is not, under any circumstances, a treatment for an active infection.
Precisely. If you are experiencing symptoms of an active UTI, painful urination, urgency, fever, or flank pain, you must seek medical advice. You likely require antibiotics. Cranberries show little to no difference in efficacy when compared head-to-head with antibiotics for treating an established infection. They work by disrupting the bacteria's ability to set up shop in the first place, not by killing them once they have colonized the bladder.
And this brings us to the molecular level, the why. Why are cranberries so uniquely effective for the urinary tract and not, for example, a skin infection? The answer lies in the specific chemistry of the active ingredients and a really elegant mechanism. Let's focus on proanthocyanidins, or PAKes.
PAKes are the absolute star molecules here, but not just any PAKes. We're talking about the A-type PAKes, which are unique to the American cranberry, Vaccinium macrocarpum.
And the A-type matters.
It matters immensely. The reason this specific chemical designation is so important is due to the linkage structure. PAKs are chains of flavonoid units, but only the A-type linkage, which is a kind of double bond connection, provides the necessary structure to interfere with bacterial adhesion. Other common berries like grapes or even green tea, they have B-type PAKs. They lack this double bond and therefore do not provide the same critical anti-adhesion effect against the bacteria that cause UTIs.
So the magic is literally in the molecular glue holding that PAK chain together. That's fascinating chemical specificity. Now let's detail the mechanism. How does this large A-type pack molecule, which we'll learn is actually quite poorly absorbed, how does it manage to prevent bacteria from sticking to the bladder wall?
It's a beautiful, purely physical mechanism. The main culprit in the vast majority of UTIs is a specific strain called P-fimbriated E. coli. These bacteria are exceptionally good at adhering to surfaces. They have these tiny hair-like structures called fimbriae, specifically P.
The
fimbriae,
little grappling hooks?
exactly like microscopic grappling hooks or Velcro. They use these hooks to latch onto specific receptor sites on the uroepithelial cells lining your bladder and your urethra. This adhesion is the mandatory first step for colonization and infection.
And the PEGs intercept this step.
Precisely. The A-type PEGs, or more accurately, the active metabolites they turn into, they essentially gum up the works. They bind to the tips of those P. fimbriae grappling hooks, changing their shape and preventing them from recognizing and binding to the bladder wall receptors.
So the compounds don't sterilize the urine, they don't kill the bacteria, they simply disarm the grappling hooks, preventing them from establishing a foothold. It's a physical washout mechanism.
Exactly. Without the ability to adhere and colonize, the E. coli bacteria are rendered harmless and are efficiently flushed out naturally with every act of urination. And this is confirmed by rigorous dose-mechanistic RCTs. They show that this anti-adhesion activity is directly detectable in the urine after consumption, so it validates that the mechanism we see in vitro in the Petri dish translates perfectly to real-world human biochemistry.
Which leads directly to the issue of timing and consistency. We're talking about an activity that peaks and wanes pretty rapidly, right?
Yes. The human mechanistic data confirms that the anti-adhesion activity is highly dose-dependent and shows a rapid onset, usually within hours of consumption. Activity typically peaks around 6 to 12 hours post-ingestion, and then critically, it starts decreasing toward that 24-hour mark, especially if the dose of PAX was at the minimum effective level. This kinetic profile is what underpins the practical dosing advice we need to give, because the protection isn't permanent, it requires continuous coverage.
If that protection wears off within 24 hours or potentially sooner for lower doses, consistency must be the absolute key. And this transition leads us perfectly into the most critical takeaway of this entire deep dive: the necessity of precise dosing standardization.
If you take only one thing away from this deep dive, it should be the number we are about to discuss. For decades, the public health message was, drink cranberry juice. This led to people consuming large, often highly sugary amounts of non-standardized juice and just hoping it was enough. Now, thanks to systematic dose-response trials, we have a concrete therapeutic target. And that essential threshold, the therapeutic floor that is repeatedly validated by numerous human dose-response trials and meta-analyses, is 36 milligrams of Paxes per day. Efficacy is tied directly to the specific A-type Pactus content, not merely the volume of liquid or the number of capsules you swallow.
36 milligrams.
Yeah.
That's the scientifically established baseline required to achieve that measurable anti-adhesion effect in urine samples that successfully prevents the E. coli from sticking. And if a product doesn't guarantee it hits that mark, the clinical evidence is clear. You are likely wasting your time and money, at least for UTI prevention.
That is the hard truth supported by the data. Trials show that doses below 36 milligrams of Pax generally result in non-significant or no measurable protection. And crucially, there is a clear dose-response relationship. While 36 milligrams is the threshold for achieving anti-adhesion effects for several hours, higher doses, for instance 72 milligrams, may produce a longer-lasting, more robust activity. It often extends the measurable anti-adhesion effect through the full 24-hour cycle. So for someone with particularly severe recurrent UTIs, doubling that dose might be a strategic consideration.
Okay, let's put that 36 milligrams into perspective for the average person who is standing in the supplement or grocery aisle. What does that typically translate to in terms of product intake, based on the trials that generated these successful results?
Well, the practical regimens from the high-quality clinical trials show this 36 milligram amount is roughly equivalent to a single 240 milliliter glass, about 8 ounces of pure, unsweetened, or low-calorie cranberry beverage daily, or a single standardized capsule or tablet. We see this validated in key studies like the major Maki trial in 2016, which showed excellent results using just one 240 milliliter standardized cranberry beverage daily over 24 weeks. The absolute key, though, is that the beverage or supplement must be standardized and the pack content has to be guaranteed on the label.
And that standardization point is the #1 consumer pitfall, isn't it?
Yeah.
Most commercial cranberry cocktails or juices are so heavily diluted, they often contain less than 10% actual cranberry juice, and they're loaded with sugar. They might taste cranberry flavored, but they often fall dramatically short of that 36 milligram pack threshold.
which is why the method of measurement is almost as important as the dose itself. Pake content can vary up to 14-fold between different cranberry cultivars, harvesting times, and, most importantly, processing methods. Relying solely on the species name or the color of the juices, well, it's medically inadequate for prevention purposes. You have to look for a label that specifically declares the pake content. But even then, we need to talk about the measurement method.
Ah, yes. You mentioned the DMAC method. Why is that so critical? Why does the label need to specify 36 milligram packs measured by DMA?
This is a really critical point for consumer protection. DMA stands for dimethylaminoacetaldehyde, and it's a specific assay, a lab test, that is the gold standard for measuring packs. Older, cheaper methods often measure total phenols. That means they include all antioxidants like vitamin C or generic anthocyanins, which might make the product look potent, but fail to quantify the specific A-type PAC6 that are actually responsible for the anti-adhesion effect.
So if a label just says total antioxidant content or total polyphenols, you might be buying 36 milligrams of compounds, but none of them might be the active A-type packs.
Exactly. The DMAOC method is precise because it targets the unique chemical structure of the PACs. It ensures the milligram figure you read on the label actually corresponds to the active adhesion-inhibiting compounds validated in the clinical trials. If a product doesn't specify the DMAC measurement, you should be extremely skeptical of its clinical relevance for UTI prevention. Standardization is useless without a reliable, specific measurement method.
Okay, so let's revisit timing and kinetics, because understanding how the body handles these compounds is crucial for maximizing protection. We established the activity is rapid, peaking within hours.
Right.
So if that protection peaks around 6 to 12 hours and starts decreasing toward the 24-hour mark, especially at the minimum 36 milligram dose, what's the practical implication for someone aiming for continuous coverage?
It suggests that a one-and-done approach might leave a gap, particularly overnight or in the later hours, where the risk of bacterial colonization increases. For individuals with highly recurrent UTIs who want continuous urinary coverage, one might consider splitting the dose, taking half in the morning and half in the evening. Or you could opt for a higher single daily pack dose, like 72 milligrams, which is shown to maintain the anti-adhesion effect for a full 24 hours in some people. Consistency is always vital, though. The benefit is lost entirely within 2 to 4 weeks of discontinuation.
Now let's get into what is maybe the most intellectually fascinating part of this whole deep dive. The bioavailability paradox.
Yeah.
You mentioned the pack has are large molecules, and the sources state they have very low oral bioavailability. Less than 5 to 10% absorbed intact in the stomach and small intestine. So if the active ingredient doesn't get into the bloodstream efficiently, how does it manage to reach the urinary tract?
This is a remarkable interplay between phytochemistry and human biology. The majority of these large, complex PAC molecules, they do not get absorbed in the early digestive tract. They travel intact all the way through the stomach and small intestine and arrive, largely unchanged, in the colon. And once in the colon, they are greeted by the gut microbiome.
So our gut bacteria are the key players here.
They are the factory. Your personal community of gut bacteria metabolizes these large packs into smaller, absorbable, active phenolic metabolites, things like valerolactones and other phenolic acids. It is these smaller metabolic breakdown products, not the original packs, that are then absorbed into the bloodstream, processed in the liver, and finally excreted into the urine.
So the anti-adhesion effect in the urine is mediated not by the large packs you ingested, but by the smaller metabolic products created by your own gut bacteria working on those packs. That completely flips the script. The cranberry is essentially a prebiotic that feeds your microbiome, which then produces the medicine.
That is the perfect synthesis. And this pathway also underlines why there might be individual variability in the effectiveness of cranberries. If someone has a compromised or a distinct gut microbiome, their ability to process PACs into the necessary active metabolites might be reduced. This is a huge area for future personalized research. But the overall mechanism is clear. PACs feed the system, and the system produces the active metabolites that work locally in the urinary tract.
Given all this complexity, A-type PACs, DMSM method, the need for gut processing, let's consolidate this into concrete product selection advice for someone who wants to maximize their result.
First and foremost, prioritize standardization. Look for products, be it juice, powder, or capsule, that specifically declare the A-type PAC content and ideally specify that the DMC method was used. And aim for that 36 milligrams per day or higher threshold.
And given the need to avoid counteracting potential metabolic benefits, the formulation matters a lot.
Absolutely. While some trials showed juice had superior efficacy, possibly due to the simple benefit of increased hydration, you have to choose low sugar or unsweetened options. Avoid cranberry cocktails. They are essentially sugar water with a splash of juice and almost certainly fall below the 36 milligram pack threshold, while simultaneously delivering an unnecessary sugar load that negates any potential cardiometabolic benefits.
So for precision dosing without the sugar, what's the best format?
Freeze-dried powders or standardized high-potency capsules are often ideal. They offer the advantage of retaining high potency and avoiding heat processing loss. And critically, they lack added sugar. The sources note that heat, like pasteurization and prolonged storage, can degrade anthocyanins and alter the package structure. So minimally processed forms like cold-pressed juices or freeze-dried powders are generally preferred. They maximize the chemical profile that delivers all the potential benefits.
Okay, we've nailed the gold standard of UTI prevention. Now we move into the territory of general health and chronic disease prevention. Here, the evidence certainty shifts significantly. We're moving from moderate to high down to low to moderate certainty. We're looking at smaller statistical effects, usually measured in biomarkers, which are warning signs, rather than hard clinical endpoints like avoiding a heart attack.
This is where we see the overall polyphenol capacity of the cranberry come into play. The mechanism shifts from that highly specific A-type PADA anti-adhesion mechanism to the more generalized antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects provided by the broader array of polyphenols, anthocyanins, and flavonols in the berry. The results here are promising, but they're consistently modest.
So let's start with the cardiovascular system. What signal are the human trials picking up regarding oxidative stress and lipid profiles after consistent cranberry consumption?
Well, the good news is that human trials consistently demonstrate a reduction in markers of oxidative stress. For example, studies demonstrated a measurable decrease in oxidized LDL, that is the form of bad cholesterol that actually penetrates the arterial wall and causes plaque buildup. They also noted an increased overall plasma antioxidant capacity, meaning the blood is better able to neutralize free radicals.
So the body's internal defensive system gets a measurable boost. That's great. But does this boost actually translate into moving the dial on standard cholesterol numbers?
Modestly, yes. Meta-analyses show small but statistically significant improvements in the overall atherogenic profile. Researchers specifically focused on a metric called the total cholesterol HDL-C ratio. This ratio is considered a more predictive marker of long-term cardiovascular risk than just total cholesterol or LDL alone.
And why is that ratio so important?
Because it captures the balance between the harmful and protective lipoproteins. Studies found that cranberry consumption resulted in a reduction in this ratio, with a mean difference of near 0.24. And on top of that, some studies found a slight protective increase in HDL-C, the good cholesterol, by about plus 4.85 milligrams per deciliter. These aren't effects that would replace a statin, but they represent a positive statistical nudge in the right direction.
That's a crucial distinction. A nudge, not a replacement. Now, maybe the most compelling evidence for vascular health is the effect on the lining of the blood vessels, the endothelium. How did cranberries perform there?
This is where the mechanistic data gets really interesting. Researchers use a measurement called flow-mediated dilation, or FMD. FMD is essentially a stress test for your arteries. It measures how effectively your blood vessels relax and expand when needed, which is a key indicator of nitric oxide availability and overall arterial flexibility. Poor FMD is a strong predictor of future cardiovascular events.
So how did the cranberry group do on this arterial flexibility test?
One high-quality randomized controlled trial found that consuming whole cranberries improved FMD by a measurable plus 1.3%. This suggests the polyphenols in cranberries are directly enhancing endothelial function, helping the blood vessels relax and expand more effectively. This improvement in vascular function is fundamental to reducing long-term cardiovascular risk.
And that mechanism improved vascular function is a foundational benefit of many polyphenol-rich foods. It seems cranberries fit right in. What about systemic inflammation markers, which are so central to driving chronic disease like atherosclerosis?
The RCTs show small but significant reductions in established inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, or CRP, and interleukin-6, or IL-6. And this anti-inflammatory effect was notably stronger in people already dealing with chronic, low-grade inflammation, specifically those with metabolic syndrome, which suggests the benefit might be more pronounced when there is an existing inflammatory state for the antioxidants to fight.
What about blood pressure? A major cardiovascular endpoint. What's the final verdict there?
Meta-analyses show mixed or, at best, modest effects. Some pooled analyses found a small but significant reduction in systolic BP, around minus 1.52 mmHg, and diastolic BP, around minus 1.78 mmHg, particularly over longer durations of 8 weeks or more. But other very large meta-analyses found the overall effect to be neutral or non-significant. So the consensus is that while vascular function improves, the resulting impact on hard blood pressure numbers is statistically small and unreliable. It is definitely not a replacement for standard treatment.
Okay, moving beyond the heart, let's look at metabolic health, specifically blood sugar and insulin resistance, which is a huge silent driver of chronic disease for millions. Do cranberries offer any help here?
The data here is low to moderate certainty, but it's definitely intriguing, especially for diabetes prevention and management. The focus here is on improving the body's response to insulin. Cranberry intake has been shown to reduce a key marker of insulin resistance known as HOMA-IR, the homeostasis model assessment of insulin resistance, by a measurable negligible minimal 0.59 units in meta-analyses.
And for the listener, why does a reduction in HOMA-IR matter?
HOMA-IR is calculated based on fasting glucose and fasting insulin levels, and it gives doctors a snapshot of how hard the pancreas has to work to keep blood sugar stable. A lower number means your cells are more sensitive to insulin, making blood sugar control easier and reducing the risk of developing or worsening type 2 diabetes.
And how does it translate to actual measurable glucose control for people with chronic conditions?
The systematic reviews found small but statistically significant reductions in both fasting glucose by about meta 4.11 milli-GDL and HbA1c, which is the 3-month average glucose marker. It showed a reduction of meta 4.20% to meta 0.31% in adults with type 2 diabetes who consistently consumed low-calorie cranberry juice.
Those are small numbers, but for a dietary intervention, they represent a measurable positive trend in a very hard-to-move metric like HbA1c.
They absolutely do. But this comes with a huge mandatory application note that circles right back to part 2. These benefits are small and require the user to consume low-calorie or unsweetened products only. If you choose a typical, highly sweetened cranberry cocktail, you are literally consuming a dose of sugar that counteracts and overwhelms the metabolic benefits of the polyphenols. One systematic review explicitly pointed out that these positive effects were only seen in the subset of studies using low-calorie cranberry juice, often over a minimum of 12 weeks.
So the message is clear. If you're trying to use cranberries for metabolic health, you must get the packs and polyphenols without the glycemic hit. Unsweetened juice, whole frozen cranberries, or standardized freeze-dried powder are the mandatory choices. Okay, we've established the strong evidence for UTIs and the modest evidence for heart and metabolic biomarkers. Now we venture into the newer, more exploratory areas of research where the certainty is quite low, but the findings are genuinely exciting.
This is where we see the potential for future breakthroughs, but it is critical that we frame this conversation using the very low certainty grade rating. These findings are preliminary, often based on a single small trial, and absolutely require large-scale independent replication before they can be considered clinical recommendations. So please view them as intriguing data points.
So let's talk brain health. We just established that cranberries improve systemic vascular function and arterial flexibility. And since better blood flow is intrinsically linked to better cognitive health, did any trials look directly at cognitive performance in older adults?
Yes, there was one very important and well-designed randomized placebo-controlled feasibility trial. It was conducted in healthy older adults aged 50 to 80 using freeze-dried cranberry powder over 12 weeks.
And what was the positive finding that caught the research community's attention?
They found a significant and positive effect on one specific cognitive domain: visual episodic memory. This is the memory of events, places, context, the ability to remember where you put your keys or what you had for breakfast. And furthermore, using highly specialized fMRI techniques, the trial demonstrated an increased regional brain perfusion, meaning definitively increased blood flow in memory-critical areas of the brain.
Which specific areas?
The researcher specifically noted increased blood flow in areas like the entorhinal cortex and the accumbens. The entorhinal cortex is essentially the main gateway to the hippocampus, which is the brain's primary structure for forming new memories. Increased blood flow to this vital memory hub strongly correlates with the observed improvement in memory performance.
That is extremely promising, especially with a global concern around age-related memory decline. But you rightly cautioned that this is very low certainty. Why do we need so much caution here?
Because these results represent a single, small study, and the field is not unanimous. While this one trial showed improved episodic memory and cerebral blood flow, a separate 6-week trial of cranberry juice in older adults showed completely null effects on executive function, attention, and immediate cognition. We need larger, independent replication studies to confirm if the memory benefit is robust.
So, if the mechanism holds true, The working hypothesis for the brain mechanism relates back to the vascular benefits we saw earlier.
Exactly. The dominant proposed mechanism is that polyphenol-mediated improvements in systemic vascular function, healthier arteries throughout the body, translate directly to better cerebral blood flow. The trial also noted that the participants receiving the cranberry supplement saw a reduction in LDL cholesterol, suggesting the same compounds are simultaneously cleaning up the vascular system and improving blood delivery to the brain's critical memory centers.
Let's turn to more immediate health concerns, like immunity. With cold and flu season being a constant threat, is there any credible evidence for cranberries acting as a seasonal protective measure?
There's an intriguing signal, but we keep the rating at low certainty. One small, promising RCT found that daily cranberry beverage intake enhanced the proliferation of day cells. These are a type of immune cell that plays a key role in immediate immune surveillance and response to viruses. Participants in that trial also reported fewer cold and flu symptoms, fewer instances, and shorter duration, although this was self-reported data, which naturally lowers the certainty of the finding. It's a great hypothesis for future research, but far from a clinical recommendation today.
Now let's circle back to gut health. We spent a lot of time on the bioavailability paradox, where peen phrase reach the colon intact. If they reach the colon, do they influence the overall gut microbiome composition?
They absolutely do. The packs and the high fiber content of the cranberries act as true prebiotics. Studies show that consistent daily cranberry consumption leads to a beneficial shift in the gut microbiota profile. Specifically, researchers have observed a significant increase in the abundance of beneficial bacteria like bifidobacterium and, importantly, Akkermansia.
And why is that finding about Akkermansia so important?
Akkermansia mucinifila is a bacterium highly associated with improved gut barrier function, reduced inflammation, and better metabolic health. It's often lower in individuals with obesity or metabolic syndrome. Seeing a measurable increase suggests that cranberries contribute to gut health not just by providing fiber, but by specifically feeding beneficial microbial populations. And of course, those gut bacteria are crucial for metabolizing the PEGs into the compounds that provide UTI protection.
Finally, what about the stomach itself? We've heard of cranberries being investigated for H. pylori suppression.
This is a direct parallel to the UTI mechanism, which is a great way to reinforce the consistency of the anti-adhesion strategy. Helicobacter pylori is the bacteria responsible for causing many gastric ulcers and is a major risk factor for stomach cancer. Cranberry packs show anti-adhesion effects against H. pylori, similar to how they work against E. coli in the urinary tract, inhibiting the bacteria from clinging to the gastric mucus layer.
So they disrupt the ability of the stomach ulcer bacteria to cling to the stomach lining. What does that translate to clinically?
Daily consumption of high-pack cranberry juice has been shown in some trials to suppress the H. pylori infection, leading to a temporary reduction in bacterial load. However, it does not eradicate the infection. It's considered a reasonable, though low-certainty, adjuvant strategy to support standard antibiotic therapy, but it is not a replacement for the antibiotics necessary to clear an active H. pylori infection.
Okay, as we transition into safety, we move back to high-certainty data, because safety and contraindications are paramount, especially when discussing interactions with prescription medication. Cranberries are overwhelmingly safe, but there are two major safety flags that everyone needs to be fully aware of.
Absolutely.
The first and most famous is the potential interaction with warfarin, the common blood thinner. We have all heard the anecdotal warnings, but what does the controlled scientific evidence tell us?
The initial concern arose from isolated, highly publicized case reports where patients consuming cranberry products saw a raised INR, a measure of increased bleeding risk, while taking warfarin. This was hypothetically attributed to the possible inhibition of the CYP2C9 enzyme in the liver, which metabolizes and clears warfarin from the system. If that enzyme is inhibited, warfarin levels go up and the risk of bleeding increases.
But you mentioned this is a classic case where controlled, rigorous trials tell a different, more nuanced story than those anecdotal case reports.
Exactly. This is a critical distinction. Multiple controlled, double-blind RCTs, like the landmark Ansel study and others, found no clinically important pharmacokinetic interaction with moderate daily cranberry juice consumption. And moderate is key here, typically defined as 1 240 milliliter glass per day. These controlled settings showed no significant effect on how the body processes warfarin or on the INR when the patient was stable and consuming standard doses.
So the science suggests that moderate consumption, like the 240 milliliter required for the 36 milligram peak threshold, is likely safe, provided the patient is stable and monitored. So what caused those initial frightening case reports?
The issue seems to be highly concentration dependent and dose dependent. The dangerous cases usually involve people drinking over a liter of cranberry juice per day, or more dangerously, taking highly concentrated extracts exceeding 3,000 milligrams daily. At these high, non-standardized, and excessive doses, the sheer load of polyphenols increases the potential for enzyme inhibition. The consensus now is that the risk is real only at extremely high, non-standard consumption levels.
What then is the practical, evidence-based advice for someone who takes warfarin and wants to start a daily cranberry regimen for proven UTI prevention?
The current best practice is about caution and clinical oversight. It reconciles the low risk from controlled trials with the high risk from those rare high-dose case reports. We recommend caution and, most importantly, monitoring the INR. If a patient on warfarin initiates or substantially changes their cranberry intake, especially if they switch from juice to a highly concentrated supplement, they must have their INR checked 1 to 2 weeks later to ensure their clotting time remains stable. But moderate standardized juice intake, around 240 milliliters daily, is generally deemed acceptable with routine clinical monitoring.
That is a crucial and nuanced piece of advice. Now let's address the other major safety flag, kidney stones.
This is a more definitive caution because it relates directly to the chemistry of the berry. Cranberries contain oxalates. Oxalate is a primary component of the most common type of kidney stone, calcium oxalate stones. And studies, particularly those using concentrated cranberry supplements like tablets or extracts, have shown that they can significantly increase urinary oxalate excretion in some susceptible individuals.
Which means it directly increases the risk of stone formation for those who are already prone to this condition.
Exactly. So the absolute warning here is that individuals with a history of calcium oxalate kidney stones or those with known hyperoxaluria should be highly cautious and must consult a clinician, ideally a nephrologist, before taking concentrated cranberry supplements. While drinking a moderate amount of standard cranberry juice might be safer than concentrated pills, the risk exists. And for these individuals, it should be treated as a contraindication or approached only under medical guidance.
Okay, let's consolidate this massive amount of data into a clear, actionable checklist for you, focusing on implementation based on the strength of the evidence.
Action step 1. For UTI prevention, if you are a woman with recurrent UTIs, a child with recurrent UTIs, or in a high-risk medical group, your goal is precision. Aim for a product standardized to at least 36 milligrams of A-type PAPCs daily, quantified using the DMAC measurement method.
And what's the instruction regarding timing and duration?
Consistency is more important than timing, but consistency is critical. You must take it daily for a duration of at least 12 to 24 weeks to see the full prophylactic benefit. For those seeking continuous 24-hour urinary coverage, you might consider splitting the dose or using a higher pack dose like 72 milligrams to ensure the anti-adhesion effect doesn't wane overnight.
Action step 2. For general health. If your goal is to achieve the emerging, modest benefits for heart health, metabolic control, or cognition, what's the realistic approach?
In this case, the evidence is still emerging and moderate at best. Incorporating unsweetened cranberry juice, whole frozen cranberries, or standardized powder is a reasonable choice as part of an overall healthy, polyphenol-rich diet. But it must be done with realistic expectations. Do not view this as a treatment for hard endpoints like major cardiovascular events or dementia. You are chasing small, positive statistical nudges on biomarkers like HOMA-IR and LDL oxidation.
And finally, the critical advice on choosing the best product. If you are standing in the store right now, what is your mandate?
Always prefer unsweetened, low-sugar juice or capsules that specifically state the pack A content, 36 milligrams or higher, ideally with that DMAC notation. Avoid cranberry cocktails or products that do not quantify the active ingredients. For metabolic benefits, freeze-dried powders or whole berries offer the highest potency without the added sugar, making them the superior choice.
So we've seen today that the science on cranberries is far more rigorous and complex than just a simple folk remedy. The robust, high-certainty evidence is laser-focused on one particular area, the prevention of recurrent UTIs in specific susceptible groups. And that success is entirely driven by that unique A-type pack molecule and a very precise dosing threshold of 36 milligrams.
Beyond that, the benefits for systemic health are real but undeniably modest. They offer small statistical improvements in inflammation and vascular function. The critical takeaway is that the effectiveness hinges entirely on the chemical structure, that A-type linkage, and the dose standardization. If you don't hit the 36 milligram threshold using a DMC-verified product, you are highly unlikely to experience the proven clinical benefit.
And this all raises an important question for future research, and something for you to mull over. If we can isolate and standardize PECs from American cranberries to achieve a reliable, proven clinical outcome for the urinary tract, which is driven by a very specific chemical structure, which other common fruits and berries might be hiding highly specific, medically valuable compounds that we are currently consuming for general wellness, but are totally underdosing or overlooking entirely.
We might be focused on generalized superfood claims when the true power lies in precision dosing of highly targeted, unique molecules. The future of nutritional intervention is clearly moving toward identifying those specialized compounds and standardizing them, just like we have done with the 36 milligram pack rule.
That's a fascinating thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into your source material. We hope you feel thoroughly informed and ready to shop for cranberries with scientific precision.